It was supposed to be a summer of celebration. The world gathered under bright lights and fireworks to honor unity and peace. But beneath the noise of the crowd, in the heart of America's South, a storm was quietly forming. A man, unseen and unheard, was preparing to strike at what he believed were symbols of everything wrong with the modern world. This is the beginning of a story that shocked a nation and changed the meaning of homegrown threat. Stay tuned as we uncover how one man's radical beliefs turned into a campaign of violence. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more true event breakdowns just like this one. The 1990s were a paradox. The Cold War was over. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The United States was standing tall, the sole superpower in a new world. But behind that confidence, cracks were beginning to show. Economic optimism masked growing cultural friction. The rise of cable news amplified every disagreement, from debates about religion and politics to women's rights and technology. America was connecting through the internet, but at the same time, people were pulling further apart in ideology and belief. In rural towns and quiet mountain communities, distrust toward the government was spreading. High-profile events like the Ruby Ridge standoff in 1992 and the Waco siege in 1993 deepened that suspicion. To some, those events were examples of government overreach. To others, they were warnings that extremism was taking root on American soil. It was in this divided atmosphere that one man, living far from the spotlight, began shaping his own interpretation of faith, rebellion, and revenge. Eric Robert Rudolph was born in 1966 in Florida but grew up in the mountains of western North Carolina. He was intelligent, quiet, and independent, a child of the wilderness who preferred the stillness of the forest over crowded classrooms. His family held deeply religious and survivalist views, often teaching that the modern world was corrupt and straying from divine truth. When his father died suddenly, Eric's mother moved the family to a remote area in the Appalachians, where their beliefs grew even stronger. It was a life built on self-reliance, hunting, carpentry, and isolation. Eric dropped out of high school for a time but later earned a GED and joined the army. He never saw combat, but military discipline and weapons training would later prove critical to the path he chose. After leaving the army, he drifted through jobs in construction, landscaping, and odd work around North Carolina. Those who met him often described him as polite but distant, the kind of man who could vanish into the woods for days and reappear as if nothing happened. But something was growing inside him, a conviction that his country was decaying from within. He began consuming material from extremist groups, writings that claimed moral decay was being driven by abortion, homosexuality, and globalism. In his mind, America was losing its soul. And to save it, someone had to act. What began as quiet resentment was evolving into ideology, a dangerous blend of religion, nationalism, and anger. By the mid-1990s, the term, culture war, was everywhere. Politicians debated over values. Religious leaders warned of moral collapse. The media highlighted every flashpoint: abortion clinic protests, same-sex marriage discussions, and debates about women in leadership. For millions, it was simply democracy in action. For a small but dangerous few, it was proof that the system had failed, that action, not dialogue, was the only solution. And somewhere in North Carolina, a man named Eric Rudolph was watching, listening, taking notes. He read manifestos, followed the news obsessively, and began to view himself as part of a larger mission, one that, in his mind, would make him a soldier for a higher cause. His quiet life in the Appalachian foothills was not just an escape, it was training ground for something bigger. The image is chilling in hindsight: a man surrounded by nature, believing he was called to defend it through destruction. In 1996, the spotlight turned to Atlanta, Georgia. The Centennial Olympic Games were set to commemorate 100 years of the modern Olympics, a symbol of global peace and unity. Billboards glowed with messages of pride. Schools practiced songs. Tourists from around the world poured into the city. Atlanta had never looked more alive. Security was present, but few felt afraid. The mood was festive, optimistic, a vision of the future everyone wanted to believe in. But while the world watched stadiums fill, someone else was watching too, someone who believed this global celebration represented everything wrong with modern society. To him, the Olympics were not a triumph of unity, but a stage for moral decay and government propaganda. In a cabin deep in the woods, surrounded by the hum of summer insects, that belief hardened into resolve. Eric Rudolph had decided to act. The summer nights before the games were warm and calm. Atlanta buzzed with excitement, unaware of the quiet preparation happening miles away. Rudolph was methodical. He studied maps, learned crowd patterns, and gathered materials from hardware stores across different counties. He believed his mission was righteous, that his actions would awaken others who shared his anger. As he assembled his device, the outside world moved on, unaware that history was about to change. At the heart of his ideology was a single, warped idea, that violence could purify a nation. It was a belief that would soon take the lives of innocent people and scar a generation's sense of safety. On July 27, 1996, as fireworks sparkled above Centennial Olympic Park, the stage was set, not for another victory ceremony, but for chaos. He-Man in the Shadows was ready. In Part 2, we'll walk through the night that changed everything, the explosion at the heart of the Olympics and the birth of a nationwide manhunt. It was the height of summer in 1996. Thousands gathered beneath the Atlanta sky, waving flags, laughing, singing, celebrating a century of Olympic spirit. Families took photos, volunteers danced, and the sound of music filled the warm air. No one saw the man who quietly slipped through the crowd. No one noticed the heavy green backpack he placed under a bench. In less than 24 hours, the world would watch in horror as that celebration turned to chaos. Stay tuned, because what happened next would shake America's faith in its own safety, and mark the beginning of a nationwide manhunt unlike anything before. Centennial Olympic Park was the beating heart of the Games, a gathering place open to everyone. It wasn't a stadium or a ticketed arena, it was the People's Park. That night, July 26, 1996, thousands packed into the green space to enjoy a concert. The band Jack Mack and the Heart Attack played under the lights, filling the night with soul music and energy. Vendors sold food, kids ran between fountains, and security officers kept a calm, watchful eye. The games had been smooth so far, Atlanta was proud, and the world was watching. But beneath the celebration, one man was watching too, not as a fan, but as a messenger. Eric Rudolph arrived quietly, blending into the crowd. He wore ordinary clothes and moved with purpose. To anyone nearby, he looked like just another spectator finding a place to rest. In his backpack, hidden beneath layers of material, was a homemade explosive packed with nails and metal fragments, designed to inflict maximum damage when it detonated. He placed the bag under a bench near a 40-foot sound tower, where concertgoers stood shoulder to shoulder. Then, he walked away. Somewhere between the music and the laughter, he disappeared into the night. Minutes later, a security guard named Richard Jewell, stationed near the sound tower, spotted the unattended bag. It looked suspicious. Jewell called for backup. Officers cleared a small perimeter. They alerted the bomb squad, and in those few critical minutes, their quick thinking would save dozens of lives. But time was running out. The band kept playing. The audience kept dancing. Unaware. At 1:20 a.m., the bomb detonated. The explosion ripped through the park, sending shockwaves across the city. In an instant, the joy and laughter vanished, replaced by screams, confusion, and smoke. A cameraman on site captured the chaos as it unfolded. The footage, shaky and raw, would later be broadcast around the world, the moment when celebration turned into nightmare. 1 second, we were dancing, the next, there was just ringing in my ears, and people were running in every direction. Emergency lights flickered across the park. Officers rushed toward the blast zone, stepping through debris and shattered glass. The air was thick with dust and disbelief. People searched for loved ones, calling out names that vanished into the noise. In the middle of the panic, heroes emerged. Security guard Richard Jewell, the man who spotted the suspicious bag, stayed to guide people away before the blast. His quick action likely saved hundreds of lives. Paramedics, police, and volunteers poured into the park, working side by side. They used shirts as bandages, carried victims on makeshift stretchers, and cleared paths through the debris for ambulances. There were strangers helping strangers, people they'd never met, working together like they trained for this their whole lives. Television crews who had been filming the concert turned their cameras toward the aftermath, capturing raw human courage in the middle of tragedy. By dawn, the park was a scene of devastation. The once vibrant grounds were silent, cordoned off by yellow tape. News broke within hours. Reporters rushed to the scene. Headlines flashed across screens worldwide. Explosion at the Olympic Games! Officials confirmed that one person had died from the blast, and more than 100 were injured. But the message was clear: the target wasn't just a crowd. It was the idea of unity itself. For investigators, the question was immediate and urgent: who did this? The FBI launched an investigation overnight. Dozens of agents swept through the area, collecting fragments, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing tapes. Early theories ranged from domestic groups to foreign actors. And in the middle of that confusion, a name started to circulate: Richard Jewell, the same man who had found the bomb. In a cruel twist of fate, the hero of the night became the prime suspect in the eyes of the public. For months, his life was turned upside down before he was finally cleared of any wrongdoing. But as his name was cleared, the real perpetrator, Eric Rudolph, had already vanished into the shadows. The Atlanta bombing sent shockwaves across America. For the first time, many realized that terror didn't always come from abroad. It could grow quietly, right at home. Vigils were held across the country. Candles burned outside Olympic venues. The games continued, but the joy was gone. Security tightened overnight, and the world's carefree celebration turned into guarded silence. Behind the scenes, agents traced fragments of evidence: the type of nails, the wiring, the explosive residue. Patterns began to emerge, but no clear suspect yet. Rudolph had planned carefully. He had slipped away long before anyone realized who was responsible. While investigators pursued false leads, he was already miles from Atlanta, hidden in the dense wilderness of North Carolina. Centennial Park reopened after weeks of mourning. Flowers and notes lined the fences. The Olympic flame still burned, but it no longer represented just athletic glory. It stood for resilience. The people of Atlanta refused to let fear win. Concerts resumed. Crowds returned. The games continued, a defiant act of unity in the face of darkness. But beneath the surface, investigators knew this was no isolated act. Somewhere out there, the man behind the attack was planning his next move. Eric Rudolph disappeared into the wild, leaving almost no trace. The FBI began a pursuit that would stretch across years and states, a manhunt through some of the most unforgiving terrain in America. The nation was shaken, but no one yet knew this was only the beginning. The Olympic bombing had shocked the world, but for investigators, the story was far from over. The man responsible wasn't done. In fact, the explosion in Atlanta had only been his first strike. Over the next 2 years, he would target places that represented the beliefs he despised most. Clinics. A nightclub. Communities he saw as enemies. Each blast carried the same signature, the same cold precision, and each one drew America closer to a terrifying truth: this was the work of one man, waging his own private war. Stay tuned as we uncover how Eric Rudolph's trail of attacks formed a deadly pattern, and how investigators slowly began to connect the dots. It was January 29, 1998, nearly 2 years after the Olympic Park bombing. Birmingham, Alabama, was waking up to an ordinary Thursday morning. At the new all-women healthcare clinic, staff arrived early. Patients waited quietly in the lobby. Outside, a small group of protesters stood near the entrance, something the clinic staff had grown used to. Among them was an off-duty police officer named Robert Sanderson, working security for the clinic. Inside, Nurse Emily Lyons was preparing for her day. At 7:30 a.m., a man approached the clinic parking area. He placed a green backpack near the side of the building, close to the walkway where staff and patients entered. Then he walked away, calm, unnoticed. Minutes later, the device exploded. Officer Sanderson was killed instantly. Emily Lyons was badly injured but survived, becoming a powerful voice for victims of violence in the years that followed. The blast was powerful enough to shatter windows across the block. Panic spread through downtown Birmingham. This wasn't just another random act. Investigators quickly realized this attack carried the same signature as the Olympic Park bombing. The same type of nails. The same detonation method. The same style of construction. A pattern was forming. Within hours, federal agents arrived. The FBI's top bomb experts compared fragments from the Birmingham explosion with evidence preserved from Atlanta 2 years earlier. It was almost identical. The construction, the materials, the wiring, even the way the device had been triggered, all pointed to the same hand. But this time, the bomber had left something behind. Witnesses recalled seeing a man in camouflage, with long hair and a calm expression, walking away moments before the explosion. A truck was spotted leaving the area. A partial plate number led agents to a name they had seen before in extremist circles: Eric Robert Rudolph. By early February, Rudolph was officially named the prime suspect in both the Atlanta and Birmingham bombings. But while agents prepared to track him down, he was already gone, vanishing into the mountains he knew so well. When investigators looked deeper, they discovered that Birmingham wasn't Rudolph's second act, it was his fourth. Between the Olympic Park bombing in 1996 and Birmingham in 1998, there were 2 other attacks. The first came in January 1997, at the Northside Family Planning Clinic in Sandy Springs, Georgia. Early one morning, a device detonated near the clinic's door, causing damage, but no fatalities. An hour later, as police and journalists arrived to cover the scene, a second device exploded nearby, a trap meant for first responders. Then, in February 1997, just weeks later, another bomb went off outside the Other Side Lounge, a popular lesbian nightclub in Atlanta. The blast injured several patrons and staff members, sending shock through a community that had rarely been targeted before. "We thought it was fireworks at first, then glass was everywhere, and people were screaming. It was chaos." Each time, the devices were nearly identical: metal pipes filled with nails, packed with the same explosive compound, and detonated remotely. Each time, the motive was the same: to strike fear into groups he viewed as symbols of a changing, modern America. To understand Rudolph's motives, investigators turned to his past, the isolated life in the mountains, the radical writings he'd read, and his growing resentment toward modern society. He believed the government and popular culture had abandoned moral values. He saw abortion clinics as representing decay, and LGBTQ spaces as threats to his worldview. In his own writings, found years later, he claimed these bombings were acts of defense. But to everyone else, they were acts of terror, deliberate strikes meant to divide and destroy. For investigators and citizens alike, it was difficult to comprehend how one man, living in the woods, could wage such a deliberate campaign, undetected, mobile, and ruthless. The attacks weren't random. They followed a chilling strategy: strike, vanish, reappear somewhere else. The message was clear: fear could travel faster than any bomber ever could. Once Eric Rudolph's name hit the headlines, the media storm exploded. Every major network carried the story. Photos of the rugged, mountain-born suspect were plastered across screens and newspapers. The public was fascinated and terrified. The FBI placed Rudolph on its 10 most wanted list, offering a reward for information. News anchors described him as a ghost in the hills, a man who could survive for weeks without contact, living off the land, slipping through manhunts with uncanny skill. Communities across the Southeast were on edge. Campsites, cabins, and storage sheds were searched. Helicopters combed the forests. Roadblocks went up near small Appalachian towns. But every time, Rudolph was one step ahead, leaving behind traces but never enough to catch him. His deep knowledge of the terrain, his survival skills, and his ability to live with almost nothing made him nearly invisible. By late 1998, fear had spread across the Southeast. Clinics increased security. Nightclubs installed metal detectors. Everyday citizens double-checked unattended bags, remembering the images from Atlanta and Birmingham. For many, this was no longer a distant news story, it was personal. The idea that one man could strike anywhere, anytime, made people question their safety in public spaces. And for investigators, the frustration was immense. They had his name, his face, his pattern, but not his location. The mountains of North Carolina and Georgia became both his hideout and his weapon. As agents pieced together every detail, a clear picture emerged. Eric Rudolph wasn't just an extremist. He was methodical, disciplined, and deeply committed to his cause. His campaign wasn't about random destruction. It was a message, one built on anger, twisted logic, and years of isolation. And while investigators were closing in, Rudolph was still out there, hidden in the deep forests, surviving on berries, rainwater, and stolen supplies. He was planning his next move. No one yet knew that the manhunt for Eric Rudolph would soon become one of the longest and most challenging in American history. For 5 years, a single man evaded the full power of American law enforcement. Armed with survival skills, patience, and the vast wilderness as his shield, Eric Rudolph vanished into the Appalachian Mountains, and for years, every sound of snapping twigs or rustling leaves sent fear through small towns across the South. This is the story of America's longest and most elusive manhunt, where nature itself became both an accomplice and a trap. By early 1998, Eric Rudolph was a name known across the nation. The FBI had tied him to multiple bombings: Atlanta, Sandy Springs, the Other Side Lounge, and Birmingham. A federal warrant went out. Posters with his photo appeared in post offices and gas stations. Helicopters hovered over mountain ranges. Agents combed dirt roads, caves, and cabins. And yet, nothing. Rudolph had disappeared into one of the most remote regions in America, the Appalachian wilderness of western North Carolina. This was his home turf. Dense woods, steep ridges, and endless trails. He had grown up here, hiked here, hunted here. He knew which streams stayed hidden from sight, which valleys never saw sunlight. To the outside world, it was vast and beautiful. To him, it was camouflage. When the first wave of agents arrived, they expected to find him quickly. But days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to months. The search grid kept expanding, and each new lead led nowhere. The manhunt officially launched in the summer of 1998, one of the largest domestic pursuits in U.S. history. More than 200 federal agents, local deputies, and National Guard members joined the search. Teams worked in shifts, hiking through treacherous terrain with night vision goggles and infrared scanners. Flyers went out across 5 states. A $1 million reward was offered for Rudolph's capture. But the Appalachian Mountains were unforgiving. Rain washed away tracks. Wildlife disturbed evidence. And Rudolph, resourceful and patient, always stayed a step ahead. He knew how to live off the land, foraging berries, catching fish, even raiding food storage from nearby cabins or supply sheds. Locals reported missing canned goods and empty peanut butter jars, small signs that someone was out there. One resident said, "It's like chasing a ghost that knows the woods better than the hunters." As months turned to years, the manhunt became a national obsession. Every few weeks, a new, possible sighting made headlines. The FBI set up a command post in Murphy, North Carolina, turning the quiet mountain town into a hub of federal activity. Reporters camped outside diners. Locals gave interviews. The story had everything the media craved: a fugitive hiding in the wilderness, agents closing in, and a country trying to make sense of the crimes he'd committed. But the longer it went on, the stranger it became. People began to take sides. Some saw Rudolph as a dangerous extremist who had taken innocent lives. Others, fueled by anti-government sentiment spreading through rural America, saw him as a sort of rebel survivor, standing against federal power. Posters offering tips were torn down in some areas. Rumors spread that sympathetic locals were helping him, leaving supplies along trails, offering shelter in remote cabins. Whether that was true or not, one thing was clear: the line between fear and fascination had started to blur. While the world searched, Rudolph lived like a ghost. He built makeshift shelters deep in the forest, under rock ledges, inside old mine shafts, beneath thick brush. He scavenged food from dumpsters behind grocery stores and learned which times of night the streets were empty. He moved mostly after dark, never staying in one place for long. He avoided using fires to keep warm, afraid the smoke would reveal his position. In winter, he survived the freezing cold by layering found clothing and wrapping himself in plastic tarps. In summer, he blended with hikers on forest trails, carrying just enough gear to look ordinary. Every few months, search teams would find traces, a campsite, a footprint, or a discarded can, but never the man himself. It was as if the forest swallowed him. For law enforcement, it became one of the most frustrating chases in modern history. As time dragged on, the manhunt shifted from physical pursuit to psychological warfare. Agents began to study Rudolph's behavior, what drove him, how he thought, and what might finally draw him out. They knew he was disciplined and intelligent, not reckless. They knew he felt justified in his actions, convinced that he was waging a one-man crusade. Experts compared his mindset to that of survivalists and isolationists, people who believed the wilderness was the last refuge from a corrupt world. But even for someone like Rudolph, the isolation would take a toll. Years without human contact, always on edge, always watching for movement or sound. The longer he stayed hidden, the more he became a legend, but also, the more fragile that life became. A single mistake could end it all. In the mountain towns of North Carolina, conversations about Eric Rudolph became almost taboo. Some people whispered that they had seen him. Others swore he was long gone. To law enforcement, these communities were both a resource and a challenge. Many residents were wary of outsiders and deeply distrustful of the federal government. A few openly said they admired his survival skills, even if they didn't condone his actions. The FBI tried to appeal to the public, posting new flyers, revisiting old leads, holding community meetings. But every attempt seemed to widen the gap between locals and agents. The mountains, rugged and proud, protected their own. By 2002, 4 years had passed. Then 5. The world had moved on, new headlines, new fears. But in the mountains, whispers persisted. The legend of Eric Rudolph lingered like a ghost story told around campfires. The FBI had spent millions of dollars and countless hours searching. Many believed he was either dead in the woods or long gone across state lines. But in truth, Rudolph was still there, alive, hidden, patient. He had watched the search shrink, seen the agents leave, and waited for the moment when the world finally stopped looking. The man who had once declared war on modern America had become a shadow, surviving on scraps and silence. But fate has a way of catching up. In just a few short months, an unexpected encounter in a small-town alley would end one of the longest pursuits in U.S. history, not through strategy or technology, but by pure chance. In the final part, we'll reveal how Eric Rudolph's years on the run came to a quiet, almost unbelievable end, and what his capture meant for a nation still haunted by his crimes. After 5 years of running, hiding, and surviving, it all came down to one quiet night, behind a grocery store dumpster. Eric Rudolph, the most wanted fugitive in America, wasn't caught by a SWAT team or an elite task force. He was found by a small-town police officer on a routine patrol. This is how the hunt finally ended, and how the man who once tried to vanish into the wilderness was brought back to face the world he turned against. It was May 31, 2003, in Murphy, North Carolina, a peaceful mountain town that had grown used to hearing Rudolph's name, but long stopped expecting him to appear. Officer Jeffrey Postel, a young cop with less than 3 years on the force, was making his usual early morning rounds near a Save-A-Lot grocery store. It was just after 3 a.m. when he noticed movement behind the building, a man rummaging through trash bins. Postel called out, assuming it was a vagrant or someone looking for food. The man froze. When questioned, the stranger gave vague answers. His clothes were dirty, his beard long, and his eyes wary. Something felt off. Postel handcuffed him and called for backup. At the sheriff's office, fingerprint scans confirmed what seemed impossible. The 5-year fugitive, Eric Rudolph, was finally in custody. The man who had escaped one of the largest manhunts in modern history hadn't been caught by a special operation. He'd been found digging through garbage for food. The news spread instantly. Within hours, Murphy was overrun with reporters. Cameras lined the streets. The same mountains that once hid Rudolph now became the backdrop for his downfall. For years, families of victims had waited for answers and justice. Now, they finally had a face to confront. Federal officials praised the small-town officer whose instincts ended the search that had cost tens of millions of dollars. For the first time in years, people exhaled. The chase was over. But the story wasn't. Rudolph had survived the wilderness. Now, he would face something even harder, the full weight of his actions. In 2005, Eric Rudolph stood in federal court, thinner and quieter than the fiery extremist the public had imagined. He faced multiple life sentences for his bombing attacks, including the Centennial Olympic Park bombing and attacks on 2 medical facilities and a nightclub. Prosecutors laid out the evidence in detail: the bomb fragments, the eyewitness accounts, the fingerprints, and the pattern of hatred driving it all. But then, in a stunning turn, Rudolph chose not to fight. He entered a plea agreement, admitting guilt in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. In his written statements, he justified his actions with the same extremist rhetoric that had defined his motives, attempting to claim a moral cause for acts that had taken innocent lives. But no one in the courtroom was persuaded. When given the chance to speak, victims' relatives addressed him directly. One woman said, "You didn't destroy us. You just showed how strong we could be." Another, whose friend had been killed in Atlanta, said quietly, "You wanted to make people afraid. But all you did was make us stand together." The judge sentenced Rudolph to 4 consecutive life terms without parole. It was the end of the legal battle, but the emotional scars remained. After sentencing, Eric Rudolph was transferred to ADX Florence, the federal Supermax prison in Colorado, a facility designed for the most high-risk inmates in the country. There, he spends 23 hours a day in isolation, his world reduced to concrete walls, a steel door, and silence. No wilderness. No freedom. No audience. Just time, endless time, to live with the choices that once made him infamous. For many, his capture wasn't about vengeance, it was about closure. Justice had come slowly, but it had come. The story of Eric Rudolph forced America to look inward. His attacks weren't just acts of violence. They exposed divisions and tensions already simmering beneath the surface. In the years that followed, law enforcement agencies changed their playbooks. The FBI refined its approach to domestic terrorism, focusing more on lone offenders and extremist networks operating in secrecy. Event security also evolved. From the Olympics to small-town parades, layers of protection became the new standard. And yet, even with the lessons learned, the emotional impact lingered. For survivors and families, the sound of that explosion, the chaos that followed, would never fully fade. But the resilience that came after, the strength of communities that refused to be defined by fear, became part of his legacy, too. A legacy not of destruction, but of endurance. In the end, Eric Rudolph's story isn't just about the crimes or the chase. It's about how a nation responds when hate tries to hide behind belief. He lived for years in the shadows, but the truth eventually found him, not with force, but with persistence and patience. The message left behind is clear: no ideology, no cause, and no justification can erase the harm done to the innocent. And in the quiet strength of those who lost loved ones, the real victory endures. From the flash of a camera at Centennial Park to a dim alley behind a grocery store, the story of Eric Rudolph came full circle, from chaos to silence. The world moved forward, but it never forgot. If you've followed this 5-part journey through America's most haunting manhunt, make sure to hit subscribe and stay with us. Because every crime leaves a story behind, and every story has a truth waiting to be uncovered.